The others saw Jesus. Thomas did not. And that one absence created the whole crisis. He missed the moment. He missed the peace. He missed the wounds. Most people call him Doubting Thomas, but John never does. John calls him the twin. And that name matters because Thomas is not just the man who could not believe yet. He is the man who had to stand there and hear other people speak with joy about what he had not seen for himself. Jesus did not meet a slogan about doubt. He met a worn-down disciple who could not carry one more second-hand claim. So this is not faith against evidence. It is about whether the witness can carry the person who was not present, and whether Jesus addresses only doubt or also the exhaustion that comes with it. Everyone else is saying, "We have seen the Lord." And Thomas is standing there with grief, fear, and one dangerous condition. Unless he sees for himself, he will not believe. John 20 moves in order. Mary Magdalene comes from the tomb and says, "I have seen the Lord." Later that same day, Jesus appears to the disciples and shows them his hands and his side. The risen Jesus is the crucified Jesus. The wounds still belong to him. Then Thomas enters the scene. John says, Thomas, one of the 12 called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. That line creates the whole crisis. Some have seen, one has not. Some speak from encounter. One has to decide what to do with their witness. And that name, the twin, is not just a label to pass over. Stay with it. By the end, John will show why Thomas can feel uncomfortably close. And Thomas is not just some random skeptic. John has already shown us who he is. In chapter 11, when Jesus moves toward danger, Thomas says, "Let us go too, that we may die with him." In chapter 14, he says, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" He is loyal, blunt, and concrete. He says the hard thing out loud, and he wants clarity. So when we reach chapter 20, we are not looking at the cold skeptic. We are looking at the wounded disciple. He watched his teacher die, and now he hears resurrection talk in a room thick with fear and grief. After hope dies in public, even good news can feel dangerous. John has just told us the doors were shut. Stop there for a second and feel that room. The air is stale. The bolt is heavy. The faces are worn down. This is not a clean church picture. These are frightened followers hiding after an execution. Thomas comes into that room late, and everyone else is speaking from the middle of an event that he missed. Some of what we call doubt is really self-protection. The wall you build because disappointment already hit hard once, and you do not want hope to hurt you again. John lets that tension sit there. Thomas was not there when they saw the wounds. Thomas was not there when peace came into that room. Thomas wasn't just late to the meeting. He was miles away from their joy. And when he finally spoke, he wasn't tossing out the question. He was starting to build a wall around himself. If you have ever felt like Thomas, outside the moment, hearing other people talk about joy you cannot yet enter, hit like on this video. That lets me know we are working through this together. The other disciples tell him, "We have seen the Lord." But Thomas answers with words that are much more forceful than people usually notice. He says, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe." Let's be real. He isn't just drifting into uncertainty here. He names the exact evidence he needs. And John lets that demand sound harsh because it really is severe. Still, we should try to hear him fairly. Thomas isn't asking for some deluxe version of proof that nobody else got to see. Think about it. He is just asking for the same kind of encounter the others already had. John already told us that Jesus showed the group his hands and his side. So Thomas isn't bargaining for a special privilege. He's asking for parity. If this resurrection is real, he wants to meet the same Jesus they met, the one who still carries the wounds of the cross. That focus on the body is big. Thomas doesn't say he needs to feel spiritual peace or an inner sense that everything is true. He goes straight for the marks, the hands and the side, because he wants to see continuity. The one who was raised must be the same one who was killed. To be honest, the living Christ cannot be detached from the pierced body on the cross. For Thomas, any Easter that leaves Good Friday behind isn't really Easter at all. It has to be the crucified Jesus, not just a memory warmed by grief. And here's the thing, the Greek language he uses makes his refusal even sharper. This isn't just a weak hesitation. Thomas uses a hard double negative, which means the force of his words is more like, I will certainly not believe. You can hear a man bracing himself right there. He isn't just asking for help anymore. He is building a little fortress, and is the only one who gets to decide the terms of entry. He won't let the joy in the room carry him or borrow conviction from his friends. So the deeper issue here isn't whether evidence matters, because in John's gospel, evidence always matters. Jesus shows his wounds, and John writes down signs while witness after witness fills the pages. The real problem is whether the word of trusted friends is enough when you can't see the things for yourself. Thomas has the testimony of the apostles, but he still refuses their report unless his own terms are met. There is also a more public edge here that most of us never see. Thomas is moving toward a claim of loyalty that the Roman world would hear as treason. That is where his struggle starts to turn dangerous. One kind of questioning still leans forward and waits for an answer, but another kind starts writing out a private contract meant to keep pain under control. Grief can do that to a person. Hurt can make us feel like we have to control every term or we'll just be fooled again. We move from asking for help to saying that nothing counts unless it happens our way. Once that happens, the condition stops helping the search and starts ruling the soul. Thomas isn't beyond mercy here, and John isn't trying to mock him, but it shows how close an honest struggle can get to unbelief. Right now, Thomas is still standing inside his own terms. Then John makes us wait. A full week passes, and that silence almost feels cruel. Imagine those 7 dinners and 7 long nights while Thomas watched the others carry a joy he could not enter. They had a story to tell, but he only had the echo of it. Then, on the 8th day, the wait finally ended. A week later, John brings us back to that same setting with the disciples inside the house and the doors shut. But get this, one detail has changed because this time, Thomas is there. The man who missed the first appearance is no longer outside the circle when Jesus comes. And Jesus comes anyway, not because the room is finally safe or the fear is lifted, but while the doors are still shut. The old fear is still in the room, but now there is something else too. Thomas has shut himself against joy, and the risen Christ isn't kept out by that either. What Jesus says first matters just as much as the fact that he showed up. He doesn't start with an accusation or lead with the fact that Thomas failed. He says, "Peace be with you." That is the same word he spoke to the others before, and it tells you something about the heart of this scene. Thomas is going to be corrected, but that correction happens inside of peace. Jesus doesn't shame him into faith. He speaks as the Lord who knows exactly how frightened people come to trust. Then the moment tightens up. Jesus turns to Thomas and repeats the very terms Thomas had said. He says, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side." Almost every line Thomas demanded is handed right back to him. That changes things because it means Thomas was never speaking into an empty room. The demand he voiced to his friends had been heard by the risen Jesus himself. Thomas thought he was waiting in absence, but when Christ appears, he shows that the whole struggle was fully known. That is where the mercy of Jesus lands with real force. He doesn't crush Thomas for needing help, but instead meets him exactly where the need has taken shape. He doesn't ask how Thomas dared to request proof. He basically says, "Here I am, bring your demand into my presence." He does this by opening the very places where he was wounded, showing the nail marks and the pierced side with a startling kind of intimacy. This matters for anyone who has poured out raw thoughts in private and wondered if Jesus only heard the words. He heard Thomas fully, and he hears the wound that sits under the demand. But mercy here isn't just giving into what Thomas wanted. Jesus meets the need without letting the need stay in charge. He gives Thomas what Thomas asked for, and then he speaks a word that reaches away below the request itself. That word is often translated as, "Do not doubt, but believe." But the Greek is actually much more active. Jesus says something closer to, "Do not become unbelieving, but believing." That changes the feel of the line. Jesus isn't just naming a mood that will pass. He is warning Thomas about the direction and what his current stance is turning into. This isn't just a call to stop hesitating. It is a command not to move into unbelief. And that word become is the key. Jesus is talking about movement. Thomas is standing at the threshold where a real struggle can slide into something much more fixed. A person can start with wounded questions and end up taking up residence in a refusal to believe. Jesus addresses that danger directly. He doesn't deny the wound or dismiss the need for help, but he calls Thomas away from being defined by his resistance. That lands close to home for a lot of us. There is a real difference between bringing your struggle to Christ and letting the struggle rename who you are. One person can stay honest and open, but the other starts to fall inward until the question becomes a home, then a master. Jesus sees that movement in Thomas and interrupts it before the work is finished. Jesus has brought us to the edge of the answer now. Jesus has appeared. The invitation has been given and the warning has been spoken. Then the story does something quiet and deliberate by leaving a silence right where we expected the final proof. What happens next is one of the most discussed silences in the Gospel of John, and it really makes you think about how we remember these stories. Church tradition usually assumes Thomas did exactly what Jesus invited him to do. And for centuries, Christian preaching and art have depicted him reaching forward to touch those wounds. We see him finally yielding because the evidence became physical in the most direct way possible, which is a reading that has deep roots and is easy to understand. Jesus names the hands and he names the side. So the invitation sounds concrete. But if you look closely at the text, one thing is missing. John never actually says Thomas touched him. And that's the key right there. It is striking because so many of us picture the scene through latter art, especially Caravaggio, where Thomas leans in and pushes his finger into the side of Jesus. That image is vivid and hard to forget. But John does not narrate that act at all. He reports the invitation and then moves straight to the confession where Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." If you have always pictured Thomas touching the wounds, tell me in the comments, because I want to know if you think he touched or if the invitation itself broke him open. John leaves the act unreported and puts the weight on the answer Thomas gives. That does not prove touch never happened, but the text leaves room for us to wonder. And that is why Christians have differed on it for hundreds of years. Some readers infer that Thomas touched because Jesus offered the proof in such direct terms, while others think the offer itself shattered his resistance. Jesus had full knowledge of the private demand Thomas made, and seeing that disclosure might have been enough before any physical contact had to happen. John's silence pushes us to ask what he cares most about. And the answer seems clear because he cares most about recognition. So the stronger reading, I think, is that Thomas believed at the revelation and invitation of Jesus, whether or not physical touch followed. The turning point is not the finger of Thomas, but rather the self-disclosure of Christ. Jesus stands before him as the crucified and risen Lord who knows the words Thomas had spoken in private, and he opens his wounded body without reserve to call him out of unbelief into faith. That is enough to bring the confession, and it changes how we read the whole scene. If the story were mainly about tactile verification, John could have centered the action there, but instead, he centers the person of Jesus and the response of Thomas. This fits the way John writes all through the gospel because signs matter, but signs are never the destination. They point people to who Jesus is. So here too, the story does not climax in an examination. It climaxes in confession. And that is why the narrative silence is not a problem to solve and a move to past. It is part of the meaning. And John does not invite us to stare at the hand of Thomas. He invites us to listen to the words of Thomas speak. And once those words are out, the whole gospel rises to meet that answer. Thomas answers Jesus with words that deserve to be heard slowly. "My Lord and my God." He doesn't say, "Now I get it," or "This is amazing," or even, "You are really alive." His answer goes much further than the fact of resurrection because it names the identity of the risen one standing before him. In the first century world, that confession carried real danger. And these were the kinds of titles emperors wanted wrapped around themselves. Thomas is not only speaking worship, but is giving Jesus the loyalty Caesar wanted for himself. And he does not merely admit an event, he confesses a person. That matters because some readers have tried to soften the line, as if Thomas were just blurting out a startled religious exclamation with no real address. But John does not frame it that way, and he says Thomas answered and spoke to him directly. In the flow of the scene, the strongest reading is the plain one, and Thomas is speaking to Jesus rather than looking past him. He is not splitting the words between heaven and earth, and the confession lands on the wounded, risen Christ himself. And in the Gospel of John, this is big. Think about how the book began when it said, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." John tells you at the start what the story will slowly unfold. And the one moving through Galilee and Judea is not just a messenger from God. He is the Word made flesh who speaks, heals, weeps, and suffers. Then near the close of the Gospel, a disciple says back to Jesus what the prologue told the reader at the opening. And the claim at the beginning becomes the confession at the end. This is why Thomas should not be reduced to the disciple who lagged behind. Because in the hands of John, he becomes the disciple who speaks the summit of the gospel out loud. Others have spoken truly about Jesus before like this, like when Nathanael called him the Son of God and the King of Israel. Martha confessed him as the Christ and the Son of God. And those are real and weighty declarations. But here, the language rises with unmatched force. The crucified teacher Thomas followed is now addressed as Lord and God, and that changes things. And notice the small word that gives the whole confession its warmth. My. Thomas does not only say the Lord and the God, but he says my Lord and my God. That is not abstract theology floating above real life, but it is personal allegiance and worship with the distance gone. Thomas is not filing a conclusion, but he's yielding himself to the one he belongs to. The one he once followed in confusion and then resisted in grief now stands before him as his Lord. That personal note also protects the scene from becoming a cold doctrinal slogan, because John is not less than theological here, but is more than theoretical. Thomas is not solving a puzzle, but he is meeting the risen Jesus and answering with the fullest words he has. This is what living confession sounds like when it holds truth and surrender together. And Jesus is not merely understood, he is owned, adored, and confessed right there. Something else matters here too, and is the fact that Jesus does not correct Thomas. He does not pull the words back or say, "You've gone too far." In the scene as John tells it, the confession stands, and the gospel leaves it in place as the right answer to the right revelation. So Thomas is transformed in a way people often miss, and he enters the story as the disciple who will not rest on the witness of others. He leaves it as the disciple who gives later readers one of the clearest confessions in the New Testament, and his story does not end in hesitation, it ends in worship, and that is the key. That is why this moment still speaks to people who struggle, because faith does not always reach its clearest speech when every question has disappeared. Sometimes it clears when Christ stands at the center and the defenses finally give way. And Thomas is not remembered best by the demand he made. He is remembered rightly by the Lord he confessed. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Where in your life are you choosing to confess Christ as Lord, even when it costs you something? Thomas got his moment in that room, but Jesus knew that for the rest of history, the room would be empty. He was already looking past the face of Thomas and straight into yours. Jesus does not leave the scene with Thomas alone. And after receiving that confession, he turns the meaning outward to everyone else. He asks if Thomas believed because he saw him. Then he says that people who have not seen and yet believe are truly blessed. You should hear that as a gift left in the room for people who would come later, because that blessing was not lost when the doors opened and the disciples walked out. John carried it forward for readers who would never see what Thomas saw. But let's be real. This lie is not praise for blind faith. This gospel is full of testimony and signs and wounds and memories and witnesses that were put there for a reason. John is showing us a shift in how evidence reaches people after the first Easter. Thomas believes because he is standing in the presence of the risen Jesus. But later believers will not get to stand in that room. So what will they have to hold on to? John's answer is witness. And he shows this starting with Mary, then moving to the disciples, and finally landing on the written gospel itself. The blessing we find in verse 29 is for people who believe through trustworthy testimony when direct sight is no longer given. John makes that plain in the next two verses by saying Jesus did many other signs in front of his disciples that are not written in this book. He tells us these specific things are written so that you may believe Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. The scene with Thomas stands right beside that purpose statement because it explains your place in the story. Thomas moved from making demands to making a confession by meeting the risen Christ. And we move toward that same confession through the witness John has written down for us. The gospel now carries that apostolic side forward into our time. It does not replace the resurrection appearance as if they never mattered, but it preserves their meaning and hence their testimony to people who come later. You can see that in the long memory of the church itself, like how ancient Christian communities in India trace their faith back to Thomas. They did not do this because they had seen the risen Jesus with their own eyes, but because witness traveled and was received and kept alive across many generations. That is why Thomas is such a bridge for us today. He stands at the seam between those who saw and those who must believe through what was seen and told and written. Now, let's be real. This reaches straight into your modern struggle. Maybe you are watching this late at night, or on a break, or with a mind that will not settle down. You are not asking for a history lesson right now, but you are asking why faith still feels so hard when you want peace. A lot of people are not asking for less evidence. They are asking for one more private appearance or one more personal condition to be met before they commit. They feel like if God would just do this, or if Christ would just show them that, then they would finally believe. Thomas gives that impulse a voice, but Jesus does not train Thomas to live by endless conditions. He meets him where he is and then calls him to move beyond those demands. So here is a concrete response for you to try this week. Open John chapter 20, verses 24 through 31, and read it slowly a few times. Then I want you to write one honest sentence on a piece of paper and ask yourself what condition you have placed on believing God. Name it as plainly as Thomas did. Then pray and ask the Lord Jesus to meet you in your struggle without letting the struggle become your master. Living by conditions wears the person down. And while Jesus is gentle with Thomas, he also gives him a warning. You can bring your struggle to Christ, but you cannot allow it to rule in the place where Christ belongs. That brings us back to Thomas one last time. Not as a slogan, but as a bridge from the first Easter to every reader who comes after the written witness John has left behind. What Jesus gave him in that moment was not just proof, it was rest. Thomas had been bracing himself against one more disappointment, or one more second-hand claim, or one more hope that might break in his hands. Jesus did not only answer that strain, he lifted the burden of having to hold the whole thing together by force. The witness was there, and the wounds were there, and the peace was spoken so that Thomas could stop gripping and finally yield. If you are tired of needing to know one more thing before you can rest, I want you to take the warning and the mercy together. Bring your condition into prayer, but do not let that condition run your life anymore. You do not have to keep guarding yourself from hope like that is going to save you. Christ meets people in that exact spot, and he speaks peace there. If you want to keep walking through scripture this way, for real help, not just noise, subscribe and stay with me here. Read John 20, verses 24 to 31 this week. Write your condition down honestly and bring it into prayer instead of hiding behind another delay. You should keep going with this and watch the next video about how God meets us in silence. The risen Jesus still meets people through the witness John wrote. And if you keep living under the weight of other people's stories while making your own terms for faith, those terms will start ruling you before your heart has a chance to soften.